Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion for this evening. My name is Quavis Peacock, and I serve here at Baylor as the Assistant Director of Community Relations and Cultural Wealth. I am proud to serve in this role within our Solid Gold Neighborhood Initiative here on campus, which is really Baylor's intentional community engagement initiative to connect the university and its resources and its students and its faculty and its staff to the broader Waco community. And we do this by focusing on a couple different areas: health, education, economic development, city growth, which is really just helping you all to understand all the arts and attractions of our Waco community, and then cultural wealth. Cultural wealth is the area I oversee, where the hope is to help you all get connected with other communities of color within the Waco area and to celebrate the vast diversity of our community. And so I am always excited to engage in efforts like this, where we are bridging the gap between Waco and bridging the gap between Baylor and Waco and Baylor, and really bursting that Baylor bubble. Something to do that I just want to share with y'all before we get started is the Waco Culture Guide. This is a document that we have created here on campus to help you all become more familiar with our Waco community. Feel free to reach out to Lauren or reach out to me for more information on ways to get connected and to access that culture guide so you can start accessing our broader Waco community. This evening, we have a great panel discussion of young Waco community leaders who are making an impact in our community. And this panel discussion will be moderated by your very own Lauren Bowe. And so at this particular point in time, I want to welcome Lauren onto the call to help introduce our panelists and to begin our discussion for the evening.
Hi guys, my name is Lauren. For those of you who don't know me, I serve as the Coalition of Asian Students representative, and I'm so honored to introduce and moderate our panel tonight. We are joined by Dr. Sue Battle, who is a board certified licensed pediatrician with a practice here in Waco. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics and a member of the Texas Pediatric Society, as well as the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. She also serves at the local Advocacy Center for Crime Victims and Children, a nonprofit organization that promotes healing for children and adults who are victims of crime. So welcome, Dr. Sue Battle. We are also joined by Dada Chen tonight, who I'm sure most of you guys know. She is a Baylor graduate, social worker, and a therapist with a private practices that helps professionals, moms, and Black and Indigenous people of color in healing from burnout, trauma, and perinatal mental health concerns. She also leads her practice from an anti-racism perspective, integrating racial, ethnic, cultural backgrounds into her work. She is also the co-owner of Waco Cha, a boba shop here in Waco that seeks to build community through food and tea. We also have Devin Lee, who is a Baylor graduate and entrepreneur. He has previously taught as an engineering teacher at Waco ISD and currently teaches at Rappaport Academy on engineering design and entrepreneurship. And he also serves as the CEO of Waco Cha. So welcome, guys. Thank you for being here tonight and taking the time out of your night. I know you guys are really busy people. So thank you so much for sitting down and having a conversation with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. I want to start off with a question that kind of frames Asian Pacific American Heritage Month. So a lot of people have difficulty with the distinction between Asian American and Asian. Can you guys speak to the difference as to why it's important to make this distinction or what this distinction is?
I'll start. To be honest, I don't think you ever with Asians have to state that you're Asian, right? People usually know looking at us. But when I'm talking about myself, I never really made the distinction Asian versus Asian American until recently, with the whole COVID thing happening and there being a lot of racism, very overt, sometimes not overt. That was when I started realizing that maybe I did need to say Asian American to make a point of stating that I am American, that I am not any different than anybody else that lives here. But I honestly, before this year, didn't really think about the difference. Having grown up, being born in the United States, grown up my entire life, I never really thought that I was other until it was pointed out to me. So I think that became more evident recently.
Yeah, for me, I haven't, I've oftentimes used those two terms interchangeably, but then I think more common for me is to talk about the difference between first generation, second generation, and so forth. So for me, I'm considered second generation Asian American. So my parents are immigrants, right, from Taiwan, but then I grew up in America and was born and raised here, right? And what makes it more complicated is that I lived overseas in China and Taiwan throughout middle school and high school. And so that adds another layer of confusion, especially for Asians who are actually in China and Taiwan, just trying to understand my identity and where exactly I was from.
So for me, I'm actually an immigrant's kid. So I came with my parents at the age of 13. I moved to Houston. So for me, I've, I guess in a way, has always been the outsider, since I moved here. I guess it wasn't until maybe during college, during the end of college or post college grad, that's when I started adapting. Okay, maybe I am not just Chinese anymore. So I started taking the word, the wording more serious, Asian American. Like I grew up first part of my life in Asia now, and I spent the second half in America. And so, I had to ask the question all the time, am I American? When, you know, so I've been using it more often post grad.
Yeah, it's interesting because you guys both, or all three of you guys, come from different backgrounds, right? Like Jaya, you're kind of like a third culture kid, and then Devin, you're like an immigrant's kid, and then Dr. Sue, you've been here, right? And so it's odd that we like kind of we all fall into this umbrella of Asian American, and that kind of just shows like how broad and encompassing the term is, that it might be difficult for a lot of other people to understand, because sometimes it's like we don't necessarily understand exactly what it means yet, right? Dr. Sue, you talked about COVID, and so this next question is trying to get at that. COVID-19 augmented the persistent marginalizing stereotypes and anti-Asian sentiments that were already present in America, and it manifested itself through harassment, discrimination, and in extreme cases, violence. Oftentimes, victims were mistaken for being Chinese when they were not. Can you guys speak to experiences that you guys have had during COVID-19?
I guess I'll go first again. um, well, I again having it is, and I do love that the three of us have very different backgrounds. I think that's great that that turned out that way. So again, I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood in Austin, Texas. I never felt like I was an outsider until it was pointed out to me when I was little, and they'd make Asian derogatory comments little kids would to me, and that's when I would realize it. As an adult, again living in Waco, there are not many Asians in Waco, and so I have mostly white friends in my neighborhood. I have a diverse group of people and that I have luckily met through community and work and experiences and volunteering. So again, I've never felt unwelcome or other until again, this whole COVID thing. And it's little things. I've never had any comments made to me. I've never had anyone act out towards me, but I have had a sense of when I'm at the grocery store or store and people are wearing masks. There have definitely been instances where, like at a grocery store where we're all expected to wear masks, I've seen a person not wearing a mask and glaring at me. So it's a non-mask wearing person who probably is opposed to it for some reason. And then they glared at me. Were they really glaring at me? I don't know. I certainly felt that there was some sort of antagonism towards me because I was Asian. And I remember pointing out to my husband, that guy is glaring at me. Like I think he's thinking very bad thoughts about me because I'm Asian. So I haven't had anyone say anything overtly racist to me, but I have had a sense of feeling unwanted or feeling hostility towards me.
Yeah, I think for us, there hasn't been too many encounters in Waco per se. There initially at the beginning of the pandemic, we were outside on a walk at Cameron Park, and there was some. I think they were like teenagers. They looked like high school aged folks who were driving in a car, and they just started honking, and they yelled out like Chinese people, and they like pointed out their finger. But it was just kind of like, okay, that was stupid. That was the closest kind of thing that we've encountered, at least from my recollection. But I think one of the harder areas was, so before COVID actually impacted Waco, this was back in end of January, early February. My family in Taiwan was already experiencing the pandemic. And so my mom would call us like every day telling us that we need to start wearing masks. She was like, hey, you guys are business owners. You need to start requiring all your employees, including yourself, to wear masks to keep yourself safe. And I was like, Mom, like, this was in January, right? I was like, nobody is gonna wear masks in America. And even if I did wear masks, I'd probably be discriminated against. And so I think just the fact that I had to question whether or not it's safe or whether or not it's okay, culturally speaking, to wear a mask at that point in time showed a little bit into even just my fears towards racism. And it's interesting now, right? Because who knew 1 month after that discussion that there would be mask mandates? And so at that point we quickly, we're like, okay, Mom knows best.
For me, similar to what Jana said, I never really dealt with anything like not many no stories really coming from Waco. But when it first happened, obviously I'm Chinese, so and I know where Wuhan is and everything. So part of me felt like there's a great potential that I could get, get some verbal attack or something. So I had to get myself ready mentally. But luckily, I didn't really get any kind of treatment.
Well, I'm glad that nothing physically happened to you guys. I know that a lot of people who are attending have had things happen to them on campus or at the grocery store. And I think something that all three of you guys share is that your concern for public health also, like, being Asian also played into that, right? Like, because wearing a mask became a political statement. So you had to be concerned that not only are you Asian and you're going in public at a time where the president is using words like kung flu in order to describe COVID, um, but you also want to wear a mask to protect yourself, which is like another level of sort of, um, added pressure on you guys. So Yaya and Devin, Jaja, sorry, did you guys experience any? I know a lot of businesses were hit during COVID, and specifically um, Asian businesses. Did you guys have any effects, or were you guys affected by it in any way?
So luckily, we actually our store opened during COVID. The first day when Waco had its first like a shutdown, it was when we got approved to open. Like our space was approved to open. But before that, we had a truck, like a mobile tea truck, for a long time, so we were able to remain open, and we were kind of blessed. And many businesses had to close and shut down, whatever, and we were kind of lucky to be considered as the food establishment. So we were able to remain open. But we actually were able to keep up with our business. We didn't really experience any drop. I think mainly had to do with, just our communication and also our value, being community is being one of the main values in what we do. So we receive a lot of support from our followers and, our customers.
Yes, we did get impacted in the sense of course, as business owners having to maintain all the policies and regulations and keep up with, one week it's 50% capacity or the other week is 75 and just on and off literally every week, even from March all the way to now, just keeping up to date on protocols from the state and city. And then, of course, we've had team members who've been exposed to COVID. And so then having to shut down, make sure that team members get tested, and then even making sure there's quarantining and whatnot. And so just continuing to maintain that, I think, emotionally as business owners has been just like a up and down kind of roller coaster, if you will, when it comes to just managing all of that on top of the day-to-day.
I just want to remind our participants that if you guys want to pose any questions, that there's a Q&A button at the bottom right. It's right next to the share screen function or the chat function. If you guys want to ask questions, I will periodically check and then pose them to our panelists. So our next question is a little long, so bear with me. And it's how do we respond to these feelings, right? Because I think we all have a sense of fear or trepidation that happened around COVID, right? And so I don't know if you guys saw, but presidential candidate Andrew Yang, he wrote an opinion piece that encouraged Asian Americans to increase their engagement with the community as a remedy to racism. So he writes, "We Asian Americans need to embrace and show our Americanness in ways we have never before. We need to step up, help our neighbors, donate gear, vote, wear red, white, and blue, volunteer, fund aid organizations, and do everything in our power to accelerate the end of this crisis. We should show without a shadow of a doubt that we are Americans who will do our part for our country in this time of need." How should we respond to this? And if we choose not to adopt this stance, how and where should we focus our anti-racism efforts?
I'll go first. So this op-ed, I remember the day it was released because, self-disclosure, I actually really supported Andrew Yang as a presidential candidate and was very excited to be part of his campaign process and whatnot. But I was somewhat disappointed when I read his op-ed because I felt like he had the right intention, but then just the delivery in the actual op-ed just failed to communicate what he was intending. And instead of really coming across the right way, it sounded more like, okay, we have to be quote unquote American by doing all these behavior responses, right? And I like to say, so growing up with Taiwanese immigrant parents, my parents would always refer to Caucasians or white people as American. And then everybody else was referred by their ethnic background in Chinese, right? And so when I read that op-ed, I just automatically kind of felt like when he said American, it meant like being white or being Caucasian. And more so, I interpret it more so as like, oh, and we have to like prove our value or prove who we are. And I just really did not agree with that at all because, I feel like for too long, we have had to become known as, the model minority and all of those myths. And so then that really just prevents us from being able to just embrace our actual culture, right? The unique Asian American identity and culture, right? And so the second part of your question was what do we do then, or how do we move in anti-racism? I would say those actions that Andrew Yang pointed out are really important to get involved in, but those are not things that we do to prove our Americanness. It's more so, we participate in those actions like volunteering, voting, being part of the community, because we're already American, period, right? And then to move in anti-racism, I'd say sometimes that might even involve starting to create organizations and spaces where there is not already Asian American identity, or where it doesn't even exist, right? So sometimes that involves being part of pre-existing organizations, or running for campaigns like Andrew Yang did, but that also might involve creating spaces and organizations, and leading out in that, especially if it's an area where there's not even anything in existence yet, right?
Just shout out, I remember when that article came out, and but so, kind of like what Josh said, I think what he said wasn't exactly wrong, is how he said it. And I think, there's some stigma, I think, in the Asian community not being as vocal, the model silent minority um, thing, the name that we get called with. And so, but kind of like Jada said, you know, we don't need to do all these things to prove they're American. Um, and same thing, even like the same story, how, our parents would call the white people as Americans, and where other people are just, the Indians or Black people or, Mexicans, but just for some reason, they often refer white people as, the Americans. And I even find myself saying that at times. Like, I remember one of the recent conversation, when first COVID was first happened, I was talking to my mom, and my mom told me to start wearing masks. But then I was like, well, the Americans are not gonna feel happy about it, or they're gonna feel weird. Will look us weirdly. Um, so yeah, but I agree that the Asian community does need to get um, involved, um, but it's not to do it to prove ourselves that we're finally Americans, or yeah.
Yeah, and I would just, reiterate, they both kind of said it all. I think he had good intentions, but he definitely was actually feeding into racist thought and stereotypical thought, and that we are the others, and that we are not American, and that we are foreigners. And him saying that just fed right into it. And so what do we do instead? I think we need to, doing all those things are great just to do as citizens in general. I don't do those things to prove that I'm American. That doesn't even cross my mind. I just do those things, and it didn't cross my mind that I wasn't perceived as American. So saying those things, saying that that's how I have to prove it and show it, kind of feeds into it. And that's so what I think we have to do instead is talk about our own stereotypes that we are perpetuating. We have to acknowledge those in order to speak out against those. And if we don't speak out against them, and we actually encourage them, then we aren't going anywhere on this talk of anti-racist actions. So I think what we have to do as Asian Americans is speak to our own stereotypes that we still hold, and have other people acknowledge the stereotypes that they have, and then show how we can move past that. We need to have conversations about that, or else it doesn't really change.
We kind of, Jaja and I watched the PBC documentary on the Asian American history. That was really eye-opening. I remember learning about like one of the reasons why the Asian community was much more silent was because often they want to get citizenship, and they often kind of get treated. It was almost like a trauma response, where they looked at what the Black community was doing during the civil rights movement, and they're kind of like, well, we don't want that to happen to us, and we want to pursue our citizenship. And so it wasn't just a compliment, it was rather a trauma response that our Asian Americans had back then.
Yeah, I think Jaja said too, the whole model minority thing. Again, that's a white supremacy version of keeping the Asians down by saying they're like us, and hence they're the model minority because they are as close to us and submissive at the same time, and doing things that we ask and not speaking up, and see how that's different than these other groups who are trying to protest and try to get more rights, do what the Asians are doing. They're quiet and they're working hard and they're smart and they're doing all of the right things to be closer to us. So again, what Andrew Yang is saying kind of fed right into that. Like, just be the good citizen, be the perfect American, and then everything will be fine. So we have to kind of work to make sure that we're not following that stereotype.
Yeah, I'm glad you guys mentioned this. I mean, I think it was going to come up in our conversation anyways. And it's unique in that the model minority myth is America or white supremacy's view of the American dream working, right? It's Asian Americans or Asians coming over and working so hard that they have financial stability, and it's pointing to them, and it's looking at them and saying, why aren't other groups like this, right? It's a disciplinary tool. But in doing so, it also puts us in a unique position where we feel like we're kind of in between. You know, we're not fully whites, but we're honorary whites. And so we're sort of in this limbo where we're in between white people on one end and then Black people on the other end. And a lot of people call it like racial triangulation, where we're kind of cast aside. And I like how you guys talked about how it's people within our communities who still filter into this kind of thinking, even though they're attempting at anti-racism, right? Like Andrew Yang is trying to say that this is not right. But his solution to that is, let's overcome this by working hard, right? And working past this, so that we can achieve a level of Americanness. And I want to get more into like what you said, Jaja, about how can we create spaces, or like how can we combat this? Like, where do we move after this? Like, what do we do?
Well, I think first of all, kind of touching on what Dr. Sue was talking about, we have to first identify, the racist thinking and the racist, the racist thoughts and ways, like even within our own community. Like, we need to start with ourselves and examine that within our own culture. So instead of just like jumping straight to doing, it's even examining our history, right? Examining, like really starting to understand, like, okay, why is there even a model minority myth? Why is there these stereotype, right? For Asian Americans to have to be XYZ, right? And so I think the history is really important. Devin referenced the PBS Asian American documentary that had come out that talks a lot about the history of Asian American identity within America. And so that one's really excellent. And I think also then from education, we then can be able to start to dialogue about the issues, to be able to examine our own biases, our own stereotypes. And then that's when we can then start to move in the actions, right, that moves against that. So of course that starts personally with each person, but then also involves organizations too, and businesses, and more systemic level kind of areas. So it involves, when it comes, if we're in a leadership position, how are we creating policies that seek to move against racism, right? And really seeing racism as broader than just one-on-one direct kind of verbal kind of or actions. Ibram Kendi has a really great book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he lays out a lot about how anti-racism is not just about the individual relationship that you have, but more so about challenging structures and systems that continue to perpetuate racist thought and ideology, right?
So I felt like for me, that mindset that Andrew Yang, I had it during college, and I was part of like fraternity and all that stuff, and being an immigrant's kid, that was very unusual. But I was really highly adaptable. So after a full year of that, I just kind of became this person where I kind of just thought like my white peers, So that I had this false mindset of I was American enough. But it took me several years, even after meeting Jada and getting married to a social worker, I had to challenge all those false beliefs and whatnot. So it took me a while, even to learn about my own privilege as Asian American, even like the anti-blackness, the racism within the Asian culture, and it's just as heavy. Um, and just kind of realize the privilege I had, even as immigrants. You know, immigrants often had to work hard, but there's even privilege within that. So that's something I had to learn myself. And then so it's been a process learning about my identity and being even more comfortable with my Asian identity. So that's been a process.
I agree. I think that's exactly right. It's a process. I mean, again, from gosh, my college was so long ago that I do remember being in a sorority surrounded by white people. My boyfriend, now husband, is white. Um, Grew up in a high school with all white people. Again, it didn't dawn on me somehow naively. It didn't dawn on me that I was not like everybody else. Especially as I got older. Again, elementary school, they have the little playground teasing, and that was evident at a young age. But then once I got to be older and in college, I still somehow was in a little bubble. But then now being, going through working in medicine, now working on a nonprofit, and then in the last year or two, this process of learning about racism, history of our country, history of all the policies. That has been overwhelming at times, learning and discussing, and that's where it starts. And again, that's why I think self-evaluation is important at the beginning of this journey, and talking and discussing with people with different perspectives. Again, even talking to Devin and Jaja, their perspectives are totally different, even though we're all Asian American. So talking about it and learning your own biases and prejudices is huge, because then you can discuss with other people about how you have perceived other races, and not just being a quote victim of racism. What have I done? What have been my own prejudices been? And that makes it a lot easier to have discussions, and to start moving towards a common goal.
Right. And I don't think this gets discussed enough, because I think oftentimes when people talk about racism, it's white people versus everybody else, right? But as you mentioned, Yaya, the reason why racism is so potent is because there are structures that keep people down, right? And Asian Americans, like you said, Devin, like we have a privileged position in those structures, right? And you guys mentioned education and being open to, or opening your eyes to this sort of privilege or complicity. Are there any books, movie, television shows that you guys would recommend to students to read or watch, in order to help either identify the Asian experience or to educate themselves further?
Yeah, so I referenced Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. He just came out with a complimentary journal that coincides with that, and it has a lot of really great discussion questions if people want to do a book group. There's a really great documentary that talks about the criminal justice system. It's called 13th. It's on Netflix, and that can be a starting point to starting to learn about policies within governmental systems that can perpetuate racism. And then if you're wanting to learn from a Christian perspective, The Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby is one that talks about racism within the church, Christian church in America, and talks about the history along with some tools or even practicals on how do we move towards anti-racism.
For those of you who are attending, I will put the name of the things that the panelists mentioned in the chat function so you guys can see what it looks like. So Dr. Sue or Devin, do you guys have any, I know you, Devin, you mentioned the PBS documentary. Dr. Battle, do you guys have any TV shows or movies or books that you guys recommend to our attendees?
I had just finished reading Ibram Kendi's book, also How to Be an Anti-Racist, and it's excellent. I know he has another one, Stamped from the Beginning. I have not read that yet. I've heard also that that's a good one. I have done a lot of actual more live trainings where I learned a lot. There was the one through the Waco Foundation, the Racial Equity Institute, was a 2-day training, and then we've done groundwater trainings. I've attended several of those. So getting involved in something like that is excellent if you can find those resources, which in Waco, we have a ton of them, which is just great. I feel like Waco is very ahead of a lot of places in the country in that we are doing a lot of anti-racist work and doing stuff in our community to try to make changes and to learn and to have these discussions. So yeah, there's also the Netflix one, 13th, and there's several Netflix documentaries right now. So if you go to bookstores too, there's often now, because this space and discussion about anti-racism is very important these days. Even I know at Fabled Bookstore, they had a whole section on books on anti-racism, which is great. So there's a lot of resources out there for people to find and read.
Can you point to any specific ways that attendees can get involved in these trainings in the community? Or you mentioned like some of the work that Waco is doing. How can they be a part of that?
So Waco Foundation, if you are a business leader, a community leader, work in a nonprofit, work at Bail, I mean, any way that you can get in. Unfortunately, of course, with COVID, they're not doing live trainings. They are still doing virtual though. They just started doing a sign up for that. So you can contact the Waco Foundation and ask about doing a race equity, diversity training. They will provide you resources to get hooked up with that. Joining programs through the chamber. For teenagers, even, they have teen leadership, then they have Leadership Waco, then they have the Leadership Plenty. So there's lots of different opportunities in Waco through the chamber, through the Waco Foundation, Cooper Foundation, lots of different opportunities for you to get involved in the community. And almost inevitably with those organizations and community and leadership training comes race equity training, diversity, equity, inclusion. I mean, there's a lot of things available in Waco if you can find those big foundations and organizations that are doing that work. And then you start kind of getting and meeting people through that. And now I feel like, I mean, Cuevas and I now have been on multiple Zooms just in the last month, because again, you start finding groups and organizations and leaders that are wanting to get involved and wanting to be in this space. And so it's easy to find in Waco, surprisingly.
Someone asked a question about how can Asian Americans continue to advocate for our own voices to be heard while also advocating for Black lives? Is there room for conversations, both conversations at once?
Yes, I would say it's a both and, because really seeing it as much as we advocate for our own, inclusion or even just our own identity and acknowledgement, right? All the work that you do within anti-racism is going to uplift all Black, Indigenous persons of color, right? So that includes Black people, Indigenous, Natives Americans, and it also includes other persons of color, whether that's Latinx or Asian American or even immigrants. But I think it's important for us to see it as like a both and, as opposed to like a either or, because sometimes I think we can have a misconception of thinking that advocating for racial justice means an only Black or white kind of conversation, and leaving out a lot of populations in the discussion or even in the process.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think what's so potent about the myth minority is that it puts us against other racial groups too, right? Like it kind of puts us antagonistically to them. So I like what you said about once we do work for a community, like we're uplifting all communities. Um, we have a question about, this is a little bit of a lighter one. So what do you guys like to do for Asian food other than going to Waco Chow, of course? And more broadly, what it's like for you to live in a city with so few Asian Americans? Like, how do you guys navigate that?
Well, I love Blasian Asian is one of my favorite places. Um, Coco Ramen. I'm trying to think of, there's not a whole lot. When I get cravings for authentic Korean food, my mom will bring it up from Austin. And as far as living in a city with not many Asian Americans, like I said, I remember when I moved here in 2005, I met two Asian American women in Baylor. One was Baylor, and one was through the community I met. And I remember I felt like I only ran into them. And so I joked to my husband that there were only 3 Asians in Waco. And I still feel like there's not many here. But in my son and daughter being multiracial, definitely I've asked them at times recently as I'm kind of talking to them more and more as they get older, because they're middle school and high school. I talk to them about racism, and we have a lot of pretty deep discussions. And I asked them once, what do you consider yourself? Like, what do you think you are when we're talking about race? Like, how would you describe yourself? Or how do you think your friends look at you? And my daughter said, oh, they think I'm white. And just like right off the bat. And my son was like, well, it kind of depends. I mean, some of them think of me as Asian and most of them think of me as white. And so even themselves in their friend groups, one of them, the younger one, thinks that she's totally like everybody else. And the other one, as he's gotten older, has realized that he's different and that his friends realize he is different. So I'm trying to have more and more conversations with him about it, not our kids, because not only is it important for them to realize they're unique and different, but I also want them to realize that in the perspective of if there's people who are Native American or Black or Hispanic, Latinx, I want them to understand who they are so that they can also recognize that there are people who are not like them as well. So I think that's really important, having children. That has changed a lot about how I look at things, because I want them to look at things differently than how I did when I was growing up.
Yeah, I know for me, living here after college, so I went to Baylor for undergrad and grad school. And then, so I've been in Waco for over 9 years now. So basically never left after school. And a lot of friends of ours that are Asian American would comment saying like, why would you guys want to stay in Waco? There's no Asian grocery store, or even just commenting on how hard it must be to be in a city, right, where there's barely any Asian Americans. And I think for me, for one thing, I grew up in Norman, Oklahoma. So Norman has a very similar population for Asian Americans compared to Waco. And so maybe growing up from that setting, I was used to always being the only Asian in different spaces. But I think another factor I always give is that I grew up overseas then in middle school and high school in China and Taiwan, where I no longer was the minority, right? And so I think I really attribute my experience living overseas as a third culture kid as what helped me to now be in America, to bridge cultures, no matter what type of population or city I'm involved in or living in, because having lived overseas and really learned the roots of my culture. And I think even just the ways that that shaped my identity really helped me to realize like, okay, um, even if I am in Waco and I'm, often the only Asian American different spaces, that's okay. And I don't think we need to, I'm not saying that everybody has to move overseas to be able to get to this point, but I think what I am saying is that we, as Asian Americans, we all need to be doing the work of recognizing like, okay, we don't need to assimilate to become more white or more Caucasian, or as my mom would say, more American, right? But instead, it's important for us to actually embrace our culture for the unique culture it is, and to then start to create the spaces if it's not there. And that's part of why Waco-Cha exists, because me and Devin, we would always drive to Dallas or Austin or Houston to get boba or to enjoy the food and drinks that we always had growing up. And then we kind of got tired. We were like, okay, instead of just wishing for things to change in Waco, we actually need to be part of the change, because we can just continue hoping one day that there will be boba tea in Waco, or one day that there will be authentic Chinese or Taiwanese food here. But instead of sitting around waiting, that's when we were like, hey, let's actually be part of the change. And I think that's the intention that Andrew Yang had in his op-ed, is this idea of like, we as Asian Americans should be part of the change we want to see. Of course, his delivery kind of failed. And so what I'm saying is that, we create spaces to move in anti-racism, right? Because anti-racism means we're moving away from centering whiteness, right? And so then creating spaces where our culture, who we are, is celebrated and embraced, and our culture flows. That's part of why we do what we do.
There is the Asian market coming up, opening soon by Nightline Donuts. I think they're going to open before Thanksgiving.
Really? What's it called?
It's called East Market. East Market.
Oh, East Side Market in that same shopping center?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
I'm surprised so many people don't know.
They have not done any marketing on that. I've seen a sign, but I didn't know that's what that was.
Yeah.
Wow.
They're gonna have
Now I'm
some
gonna
Asian
have to
groceries.
Google that. That's very exciting news, Debbie.
Yeah. We love going to Saffron, the Indian restaurant. Super good. Garlic naan, all the curries are great. We also like going to Vietnam's, which is like a Vietnamese food truck. But they just moved to East Waco, I think. They just moved to like the West Waco Drive, but on the East Waco side, on that side. We love their pho, and then also their banh mi. So those are some of our favorites. But kind of like what Jara said, essentially that's kind of why we started Waco-Cha, was just because there was no space for us to express our culture. And so we definitely we struggle so much with community, building community, even though we're part of like large faith organizations and stuff, but we just always felt lonely. And of course, as coming from Asian culture, we're taught to like invite people over for meals, and that's just what Asians do. And even there's no purpose, just eat together. So that's just kind of what we did to invite, other young couples over. But then it didn't always work because you don't always receive back. Maybe in the Asian culture, you get invited, but you kind of feel obligated to invite them back. It's kind of deal. But we didn't always get invited back. So that's when we were like, well, so we're just like really in a lonely season of our life. We're just like, we knew a lot of people, but we don't feel known and connected. And then also in our workspaces and stuff, we often have to explain ourselves. Kind of, this is what we eat. Here's why we do this. Always educating. I think there's some times where we enjoy doing that. Kind of the bridge building. Bridging cultures together, and we love doing that. But I think at times it still feels very tiring we just want to blend in, because as Asian, we also love to blend in and not feel, not like stand out. Um, so that's some of the challenges we go through, even at times now, but not as much anymore. But since we created, the business, we have a huge emphasis on community and a culture. So we were able to, so we were able to bring back a lot of our culture and bring it to Waco. So like we did the dumpling night where we invited, like 30 something guests, people for dumpling together. So that's some of the cool things that we really enjoy doing. Um, just kind of like bringing part of our culture into the Waco community instead of waiting and complaining about for things to happen.
I love y'all's sort of philosophy surrounding this, and I love your engagement with the community. I think a lot of criticism that people have is that when Asian people open businesses or create businesses, like for instance, like Korean wig shops or Vietnamese nail salons that are typically in inner cities, that they're exploitive relationships, right? But I don't think I see this is definitely different than what you guys are doing. And we have a question about minority status. Given their shared minority status, you would think that Black Asian partnerships and coalitions would be common in the States, but they seem few and far between, including in churches, universities, businesses, etc. What are your thoughts as to why these relationships seem to be so lacking?
Um, I think there's a lack of understanding of each other. So for one, when we, I'm not sure this story answers the question, but kind of. So for when we started Waco Trial early on, since we're about diversity, I naively thought to represent diversity, that means you put more skin color on your Instagram feed. So that's something that we did early on. And then one day I was still a teacher at that time, and I remember talking to my kids, kind of scrolling the Instagram feed, like, look, there's the diversity on our, through our business page. So I would, even though I was kind of waiting for a pat on the back, like, good job, Mr. Lee, you you did it. But then, they're just kids, like freshmen or sophomore high school kids, and they're like, they look pretty white to me. I'm like, what? At that point, I was kind of getting offended. And I was just like scrolling and start justifying, look. Um, but then they were just like, well, your photos look too nice, like look too good. And then so I was like, what do you mean? Like, what do you want me to do? Like, take worse photos? And they kind of like nodded, like three freshman boys. But then at that point, I realized, um, even though we're about diversity, and that's not enough. We have to do so much more. We have to do so much more empowerment of other culture. So, and since then we started doing some like the Hispanic themed drinks like horchata boba and stuff like that, or mango nata boba. Um, then so like even right now we have about 30-40% Hispanic customer group. That's all like one of our largest customer. Um, but then looking back, I realized, and we can, like, as a business, we can highlight other cultures, and then we think our boba tea are premium. So by making their drinks and kind of also making their product premium as well. So since then, we were able to do a lot more collaboration with other Hispanic drinks and stuff like that. But I think a lot of people, kind of like minority culture, there's a lot of us and them, our us versus them type of mentality. So by doing a lot of collaboration has eased some of that. Um, um, yeah.
I think part of, to answer the question for why there's the Black versus or lack of Black Asian American collaborations. I mean, one, we have to kind of look at the history, um, which was not that long ago, even like LA riots and all of that. I won't go into all of that history, but Dr. Su had kind of touched on it earlier with the model minority myth and how that was used against the Black population in America, right? To show people like, oh, look at the Asian Americans, they're doing so much better. But then that ended up perpetuating more anti-Asian and anti-Black sentiment between the two groups. Devin and I have also really talked about why we feel like that's the case. And I think part of it is also there's less similarities, even culturally, between African American and Asian American cultures. So, and that's even something that we've kind of even discussed and even just had to even work through ourselves, because we felt like, you know, personally, even in our own lives, we've been able to relate a lot more with Hispanic Americans because they have the immigrant kind of background, right? Or the immigrant experience. Many of them do, at least if they're second generation, third generation, at least have relatives who have immigrated, right, from another country, or know of folks who did. And then, you know, for even African international students, right, a lot of times we can relate a lot with their experience being having that cross-cultural kind of experience internationally, and even their immigrant experience, or even students who are like second generation African, right, in America. And so I think with the Black culture, for us, we have always been challenged, even recognize, like, okay, this is the population or the peoples, right, that we have the least similarities. And so then just even personally as individuals, challenging ourselves, right, to start to learn more about the culture, to be able to educate ourselves, so that we can, you know, expand our networks and even just get to know more people beyond who we know right now, right? And so that's part of why we joined the Centex African American Chamber, to start to even just build bridges beyond, you know, just the culture that we're familiar with.
Thank you so much, you guys, for speaking tonight and sharing about your experiences. We're running really close to time, and I want to be judicious with everybody's time, but thank you so much for coming and being honest and sharing the great work that you're doing in the community. For the panelists, or I'm sorry, the participants who are watching, how can they get involved in the Waco community? You talked about the Centex, and then Dr. Sue, you talked about Waco Chamber. Like, what are ways that Asian American students, faculty, staff members can get involved in the Waco community right now?
Yeah, I would just say, especially if we're talking about, let's start with faculty and business owners and adults, non-students first. Join those programs, and there's trainings and programs and groups of people that are wanting to have these discussions on a regular basis. And Cuevas has those resources. Waco Foundation, like I said, the Chamber, Cuevas and their external affairs at Baylor. I mean, there's so many great organizations doing this kind of work. So I would encourage Waco community members to do that. As far as Baylor students, again, joining organizations like this and going out there and being involved in the community, volunteering, doing all those things that Andrew Yang said to do is great, but it's not to prove your Americanness. It's just a great way to get involved in the community. So there's lots of available opportunities out there.
Yeah, I would suggest getting involved in different community events. So for example, Sunday, there's a East Side, so not the East Market. So East Market is the up and coming Asian grocery store. East Side Market is in East Waco on the third Sunday each month, and involves a lot, about 40 or more local small business vendor and artisan fair, and they also have food trucks. And so that is a great place to be able to get to know more local Wacoans, and also to be able to find out more about new small businesses that are locally starting up here in Waco, and to help support them as well. And then I would also say, of course, we've already passed, you know, like voter registration and all of that, but even thinking in the future, if you do stay here in Waco, whether you're still in school or even post-grad, to get registered locally here in Waco, even if you are still in school and college, And then you can get involved in the local elections by helping to support campaigns and to vote. And even if you, let's say you haven't voted this year here locally in Waco, you can still get to know your city council rep and contact them, get to know them, and you can still get engaged in the city. So know that as a Baylor student, you can still be involved even in what's going on in Waco and with the growth by keeping up to date and getting to know your leaders locally here in town.
Since we small business owner, definitely there's so many new business, coming up. So just so very easy to get involved that way, just by meeting business owners and stuff like that, especially the farmers market. Like there's a new Thai booth at the farmers market now, and heard they want to open up at Union Hall as well. Even for Asian students to even start new businesses, try it out. Eastside farmers market, they're all like really easy ways to get involved. But Waco is great in the sense that it's just so easy to get involved and to meet people. It's such a small city and whatnot. So.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for coming and speaking to us. Thank you to Cuevas and the Office of External Affairs for partnering with the Department of Multicultural Affairs for this. I think that we talked about some great stuff here tonight, and I think that our participants are probably going to be thinking a lot more about ways that they can get involved in the community after this. So thank you so much. And if you guys go to Vietnam, say that Lauren says hi, because yeah, but just say that I say hi. I don't know. But thank you so much, guys. And I hope you guys learn something from this, attendees. And to all of you guys, good night. Thank you so much.